Jackson Cole had always been a soldier, a man of discipline and survival. The young captain of the human fleet had faced death countless times, but nothing could have prepared him for the day he was captured by the Scifi. The Scifi were unlike any species Jackson had ever encountered. They were tall, with elongated limbs and shimmering skin that reflected the light in an otherworldly way. Their eyes, deep pools of violet, seemed to see into a person's soul. They came from the far reaches of the galaxy, a civilization older and more advanced than humanity's by millennia. It all started with a raid, a surprise attack on a small human colony at the edge of the known universe. Jackson's fleet had been outnumbered, and despite their best efforts, they had been overpowered. He had fought fiercely, as always. But in the end, the Scifi's superior technology and tactics left him no choice but to surrender. His capture had been swift. He had expected interrogation and perhaps some form of torture. Instead, he was taken aboard their flagship, the Venerus, a colossal ship that resembled an ancient palace more than a war vessel. The halls were vast, adorned with alien art and strange symbols that Jackson couldn't begin to understand. The Scifi didn't seem to care much about the traditional treatment of prisoners. Instead, Jackson found himself paraded like some kind of trophy. His hands were shackled, but there was no cruelty in the way he was treated, at least not physically. It was the silence, the cold indifference of the Scifi, that unnerved him the most. They didn't speak to him, and they didn't need to. He was a human, something to be observed, studied, perhaps even collected. He was brought before the Scifi monarch Queen Aralissa, a being whose presence alone demanded attention. She stood tall and regal, with a crown of shimmering crystals resting upon her head, her gaze cool and calculating, fixed on Jackson as she addressed the court that had gathered to witness the arrival of the prize. Jackson stood straight, keeping his eyes locked on the queen. He had learned early on that it was better to show no fear, no weakness. The Scifi were proud and strong, but they were not gods. He would not bow to them. But then something unexpected happened. From the side of the throne room, a young voice broke through the silence. It was a girl's voice, soft yet clear, and it echoed in the vast hall. "Mother, I want this one." Jackson's heart skipped a beat. He turned his head toward the voice, and there she was, the princess. She was younger than Jackson had expected, perhaps no older than 16 or 17. But there was something in her eyes that made her seem much older. Her violet eyes were filled with an intensity that was rare in someone so young. Her skin shimmered faintly, like starlight, and her presence, though gentle, was commanding. She pointed at him. Jackson didn't know what to think. The queen's expression remained unchanged, but there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The princess, Zyra, had just publicly claimed a human soldier as her own. The entire court fell silent, waiting for the queen's reaction. The queen's eyes flickered briefly, then she turned her gaze to her daughter. "Zyra, you cannot be serious. He is a human, a prisoner of war." "I know what he is," the princess replied, her voice steady. "But I want him. I believe he will teach me something." The queen's lips pressed into a thin line. She regarded Zyra for a long moment, as if weighing the request. Her gaze shifted to Jackson, who stood in the center of the room, still unsure of what was happening. Zyra didn't look at him with contempt or malice. She looked at him with curiosity, as if she were observing a creature in a zoo, but not one she intended to keep in a cage. "I am not a thing to be chosen," Jackson said, his voice cutting through the tension. He hadn't meant to speak, but the words came out before he could stop them. Zyra's eyes locked with his. "No, you are not a thing. You are a being, and I want to understand you. The humans I have read about are brave, strong, and resilient. I want to know why you are willing to fight for what you believe in." The queen's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing more. She simply nodded to the guards, signaling them to take Jackson away. He was escorted from the throne room, his mind racing with confusion. In the days that followed, Jackson found himself confined to a luxurious but secure room within the palace. The walls were made of a soft, glowing material that seemed to hum with energy. He was given food and water, far better than he'd expected for a prisoner of war. But he knew better than to get comfortable. This wasn't freedom. Not yet. He wasn't left alone for long. Within a few hours, Zyra appeared again, this time accompanied by a servant who brought fresh clothes for him. Jackson didn't speak at first, watching as she approached him with that same intensity in her eyes. "You have no choice in this," Zyra said softly. "But I want you to understand, I'm not asking for your submission. I'm asking for your cooperation." Jackson raised an eyebrow. "Cooperation? With what?" "With learning," she replied simply. "I want to understand your species. I want to know what makes you tick, what drives you. I've seen your people fight in ways that no one else would. You sacrifice everything for your cause. Why?" Jackson didn't know what to make of this. He'd been prepared to be interrogated, tortured perhaps, but this was different. She wasn't interested in hurting him. She was curious? "You're asking the wrong questions," Jackson said, his voice steady. "The real question is, what are you going to do with that knowledge when you have it?" Zyra smiled, though it was a small and thoughtful smile. "I will use it to make my people stronger. I will use it to teach them how to fight for something greater than themselves. But most importantly, I will use it to help you understand why you're here, why I chose you." Jackson had no idea what she meant by that, but he didn't press further. He had enough to think about already. One thing was clear. Zyra wasn't like the rest of the Zavari. She didn't want to conquer him. She didn't want to enslave him. She wanted to understand him, to learn from him. That thought was both comforting and unsettling at the same time. He was caught between two worlds, and he didn't know where he fit in. As the days passed, Jackson found himself spending more and more time with Zyra. She would come to visit him daily, often bringing books and records of human history for him to explain. At first, their conversations were awkward, filled with pauses as they tried to find common ground, but soon Jackson found himself enjoying the discussions. Zyra's mind was sharp, her curiosity endless, and though she was an alien princess, she seemed genuinely interested in what he had to say. She asked about Earth, about human cultures, about the things that made humans different from the countless other species in the galaxy. She didn't ask about wars or conflicts, at least not directly. Instead, she asked about the spirit of humanity, the drive to fight, to survive and to protect what mattered. Jackson found himself answering her questions with more honesty than he had ever expected. He spoke of Earth's history, its triumphs and tragedies. He spoke of the bonds between people, the sacrifices they made for their families and friends. And though Zyra was an alien, she seemed to understand, in her own way, what he was saying. He wasn't sure what her endgame was. He didn't know if she truly believed that understanding humanity would make her people stronger, or if she had some other motive. But for the first time since his capture, Jackson felt as if he was no longer just a prisoner. He was something else, a teacher, a guide, maybe even a friend. And in this strange alien world where nothing was certain, that small connection meant more than he ever expected it to. Jackson woke up to the sound of soft chimes, signaling the beginning of another day in the alien palace. The room was still as strange and unfamiliar as it had been when he first arrived, though he had grown accustomed to its cool, glowing walls. It was a far cry from the simple quarters he had occupied as a soldier. The bed, though large and comfortable, made him feel oddly small. There were no windows here, no way to tell if it was day or night, only the quiet hum of the ship's advanced systems, surrounding him like a constant whisper. For a brief moment, Jackson wondered if he would ever get used to this life, to being a captive in a place where everything was alien, including the people. Yet, despite the discomfort, there was a strange peace here, something he hadn't felt in a long time. He had not been thrown into a dungeon or subjected to brutal interrogations. No, instead, he had been treated with care, curiosity, and, most strangely of all, respect. The princess's words from the day before echoed in his mind. "I want to understand you." That thought was both reassuring and unsettling. Zyra, the princess, seemed genuine in her desire to learn. But why? Why a human? And what did she expect to gain from him, a mere soldier? He didn't have answers, but the questions kept him awake long after the chimes had stopped. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the door sliding open. Standing in the doorway was Zyra, as calm and composed as always. Her long, silvery hair flowed down her back like liquid light, and her violet eyes met his with an intensity that made Jackson feel both seen and scrutinized. "Good morning, Captain Cole," she said with a smile, though it was a soft one. "I hope you slept well." "Better than I expected," Jackson replied, sitting up on the bed. He wasn't sure why he felt the need to be polite, but it seemed the right thing to do. She wasn't his enemy, at least not in the way he thought she would be. She was more puzzling than anything. "I'm glad," Zyra responded, stepping into the room. She gestured for him to stand. "Come with me. I have something I want to show you." Jackson didn't question her. He had come to learn that it was better to go along with her requests than to resist. She wasn't threatening him, and the guards around the palace were always watching. But they weren't as oppressive as he'd imagined either. It felt more like a strange game, one where the rules were unclear, and he wasn't sure who the players were. Zyra led him down a long, winding corridor that was even more elaborate than the rest of the palace. The walls were lined with strange symbols, illuminated by soft golden lights that seemed to flicker and pulse with an almost hypnotic rhythm. Jackson had seen nothing like it on Earth. Every surface seemed to be alive with energy, a constant reminder that he was far from home. They came to a large open chamber, filled with various artifacts and scrolls. The room had a high ceiling, supported by pillars made of a shimmering translucent material. At the center of the room was a large table, covered in what looked like ancient texts. "I wanted to show you something," Zyra said, walking over to the table. She picked up a scroll, carefully unrolling it. Jackson moved closer, his curiosity piqued. The writing on the scroll was unlike any language he had ever seen. It looked almost like a combination of symbols and pictures flowing across the parchment in elegant, sweeping lines. "This is the history of my people," Zyra said softly. "The Zavari have lived for centuries, and our culture is one of knowledge, power, and understanding. But there's something I don't understand. Our history is filled with conquest, with the subjugation of other species. It is how we have come to rule over so many worlds, but we are not as peaceful as we claim to be." Jackson studied the scroll in her hands, trying to make sense of the alien writing. He couldn't read it, but he could feel the weight of her words. There was a deep sorrow in her voice, a longing for something more than what her people had built. "I've always been taught that the Zavari were superior," Zyra continued, her eyes distant, "that we were meant to rule. But as I've learned more about humans, about your species, I've begun to question that. Your people fight for something beyond power. You fight for ideals, for freedom, for the people you love. It's something we do not understand." Jackson didn't know how to respond. What could he say to that? He wasn't a philosopher, nor was he a diplomat. He was a soldier, trained to fight and survive, nothing more. Yet something in Zyra's voice made him want to help her understand. It wasn't just curiosity that drove her. It was a genuine desire to know more, to be better. "I don't know if you'll ever truly understand us, Jackson said quietly. Humans are messy. We fight for many reasons, sometimes for survival, sometimes for power. But the thing that sets us apart is our ability to care for each other. We're not perfect, but we fight for the ones we love. Zyra's eyes met his, and for the first time Jackson saw a flicker of something in them. Something almost like hope. She studied him for a moment, as if weighing his words carefully. Perhaps, she said at last, that is something worth learning. The conversation shifted after that. Zyra began to ask more questions, but these were not questions about war or power. Instead, they were questions about family, about love, about the things that made humans willing to sacrifice everything for one another. Jackson found himself telling her stories he hadn't thought about in years, about growing up on Earth, about the friends he had lost in battle, about the people who had shaped him into who he was. He spoke of Earth's wars, the conflicts that had torn his world apart, and yet, despite it all, the resilience of humanity. He spoke of the bonds formed in the darkest of times, when survival was uncertain, and life seemed fragile. It was something he had never shared with anyone, not even with his closest comrades. But somehow, it felt natural to speak with Zyra. She listened without judgment, her eyes always focused on him, never distracted. As the days passed, their discussions deepened. Zyra would visit him regularly, asking him questions about human culture, history, and the complexities of the emotions that drove humanity. Jackson, in turn, began to understand that Zyra's curiosity was not just about her own people's superiority. It was about understanding her own identity and the role she was meant to play in a galaxy that was vast and unknown. But their growing bond did not go unnoticed. The Queen, Zyra's mother, continued to watch their interactions with suspicion. She never openly challenged her daughter, but there was a coldness between them that Jackson couldn't ignore. The Queen's presence was always looming, as if she were waiting for Zyra to make a mistake. One evening, as Jackson and Zyra sat in the palace's central courtyard, the tension between them was palpable. Zyra had just finished asking him about human art, about the ways humans expressed their emotions, through painting, music, and poetry.
I wish I could understand your art, she said, her voice tinged with frustration.
It seems so personal, so raw. It's not always pretty, Jackson replied. But it's real. That's what matters. Zyra nodded slowly, as if contemplating his words. She stood up, turning to look out at the vast expanse of the palace gardens. The stars above were shining brightly, distant and cold. I think I'm beginning to understand, she said quietly. But there's still so much I don't know. Jackson looked at her, his eyes softening. That's the thing about learning. It never really ends. Zyra turned back to him, her expression serious. Maybe there's something more to humans than I first thought. Jackson wasn't sure what she meant by that, but for the first time he felt that she was starting to see him, not as a prisoner, not as an object to be studied, but as a person. And that, he thought, was the first step toward understanding. The days were blending together for Jackson now, each one passing in a steady rhythm that felt strangely comfortable. He had come to think of this strange alien world as more than just a cage. It was a place of learning, a place where the boundaries between two vastly different species were starting to blur. Yet, despite this connection with Zyra, something unsettling loomed over him like a shadow, an inevitable conflict that could break everything apart. Zyra had continued to visit him daily, and their conversations had evolved from curious inquiries about humanity's history to deeper discussions about the future, about what it meant to lead, to govern, to change. It was clear that Zyra wasn't just learning for the sake of knowledge. She was questioning everything her people had been taught. But the deeper she dug into human culture and ideals, the more she began to see the cracks in her own society. The Zavari, her people, had built their empire on the principles of power and control. Conquest was their tradition. Ruling over others was a given. But the more Zyra spent time with Jackson, the more she started to realize that perhaps this was not the only way. Jackson didn't try to push her in one direction or another. He wasn't there to change her, but he shared the stories of Earth, stories of revolutions, of struggles for freedom, of fights for equality. He had seen what the cost of war could be, and he had seen the kind of sacrifices people made for what they believed in. But he also knew that peace was possible, even in a world that seemed doomed to repeat its mistakes. One evening, after a particularly long conversation about the sacrifices humanity made during war, Zyra spoke in a way that made Jackson stop and truly listen. "I don't think my people are evil, Jackson," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "But we've lost something important. Our rulers, my mother, they believe in power, but not in the hearts of the people. Not in what makes us human, what makes us strong beyond weapons and strategy." Jackson looked at her, his brow furrowing. "What are you saying?" Zyra paused, looking at the ground for a moment as if weighing her words. "I think we've been wrong all along. My mother, she rules with fear. She believes that power must be controlled, that everything can be taken. But she doesn't understand what happens when you forget how to give, how to trust." The weight of her words hit Jackson harder than he expected. It wasn't just that she was questioning her own mother's rule. It was the fact that Zyra, the princess who had first seen him as little more than a curiosity, was now genuinely beginning to understand the very essence of what made people like him fight. Hope, trust, and a belief in something greater than themselves. They were interrupted by a loud knock on the door, and the guards entered, their presence as constant as ever. Jackson could see the unease in their eyes as they glanced at Zyra, waiting for her to give them orders. Zyra's expression hardened, but she turned to the guards. "Leave us," she commanded. Her voice was firm but not harsh, and to Jackson's surprise, the guards obeyed, without question. After the door closed behind them, Zyra turned back to Jackson, her face filled with determination. "There's more at stake here than I've ever realized," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. "My mother's grip on power is slipping, and I know it. But if I do anything to challenge her rule openly, it could tear our entire society apart. I don't want to see that happen." Jackson nodded slowly, understanding the weight of her dilemma. He had seen it before. People who were caught between the past and the future, torn between the familiar ways of their ancestors and the possibility of change. But Zyra wasn't just anyone. She was the princess, the heir to the throne. The choices she made now could change the course of her entire civilization. "I can't do this alone," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need help, and I think you might be the key to understanding what we're missing." Jackson felt a pang in his chest. He had never thought of himself as someone who could change an entire culture, let alone an entire species. He was just a soldier, a man trying to survive. But Zyra's words stirred something in him, something that he hadn't allowed himself to feel for a long time. Hope. He took a deep breath, looking her in the eye. "I don't know how I can help, but if it's a fight for freedom you want, I'm in." Zyra's eyes softened, and for the first time Jackson saw the princess not as a ruler or a symbol of power, but as a person, someone who wanted the same things he did: peace, justice, and a world where everyone had a chance to live freely. "I'm not asking you to fight," Zyra said, shaking her head. "I'm asking you to help me understand the heart of my people, to help me show them what it means to live without fear." Jackson didn't know what that would look like, but he knew he couldn't turn his back on her. Not now. The tension between Zyra and her mother, Queen Aralissa, was growing by the day. Jackson could feel it in the air, a thick, oppressive atmosphere that seemed to follow them everywhere. The queen had grown suspicious of her daughter's growing bond with him, and though she didn't say anything outright, her actions spoke volumes. Her eyes would linger on Jackson whenever he and Zyra were together, her gaze cold and calculating as though she was measuring every word they spoke. It wasn't just the Queen who was beginning to notice. The Scifi court, once so focused on the display of power, now seemed to whisper about the princess's newfound interest in humans. The nobles, the military commanders, and even the servants began to see the signs of change. And in a world that valued stability above all else, change was dangerous. Zyra knew this, but she also knew that staying silent, hiding her true feelings, was not an option anymore. She couldn't continue to stand by and watch her people suffer under a regime that was built on fear and domination. She had to act, even if it meant risking everything. One evening, after a particularly tense dinner with her mother and the rest of the court, Zyra pulled Jackson aside. They were in one of the palace's many hidden gardens, a peaceful space filled with bioluminescent plants and soft, shimmering pools of water. The quiet was a welcome relief after the suffocating atmosphere of the royal banquet hall. "Jackson," Zyra said, her voice filled with urgency, "I need you to come with me. There's something I need to show you. Something that could change everything." Jackson followed her without question, his mind racing. They moved through the palace, down secret corridors that only the royal family and a few trusted servants knew about. At last, they reached a door that was hidden behind a tapestry, a door that seemed ordinary enough, but Jackson could feel the weight of it. This was something important. This was something that could change everything. Zyra unlocked the door, and they entered a small chamber. Inside, Jackson saw a large map of the galaxy, one that was different from the maps he had seen before. This map didn't just show planets and stars. It showed connections, lines between planets, trade routes, diplomatic ties, and something else, something hidden. "This is my mother's plan," Zyra said, pointing to the map. "It's how the Scifi control the galaxy. The expansion, the conquests, it's all laid out here. But what they don't understand is that these lines of power are fragile. They can be broken." Jackson stared at the map, taking in the complexity of it. It was more than just a strategy. It was a vision of control. And in Zyra's eyes, Jackson saw the beginning of a plan that could change everything for her people. "We can break these lines," Zyra said softly. "We can make a different future. But I can't do it alone. I need you." Jackson looked at her, the weight of her words settling on him. He had never thought of himself as someone who could change the galaxy. But now, standing in this hidden room, with Zyra's gaze locked on his, he realized that this was his chance. This was his opportunity to help her, and maybe, just maybe, to help the galaxy itself. Jackson stood in the shadows, watching Zyra as she spoke to the small gathering of Scifi nobles. The tension in the air was thick, charged with anticipation. This wasn't just another political gathering. This was the moment Zyra had been waiting for. The moment she would finally make her move. The nobles, those who still supported Queen Aralissa's rule, gathered in a grand hall, their faces a mix of curiosity and skepticism. They had all heard the rumors, the whispers about Zyra's growing connection with the human prisoner, the talks of rebellion and change. Some were eager for a shift in power, others fearful of what it might bring. But one thing was clear: nothing would be the same after tonight. Zyra stood at the front of the room, her posture regal, her voice calm but filled with a strength Jackson had never heard before. Gone was the hesitation that had once marked her demeanor. This was no longer the uncertain princess he had first met. This was a leader, someone willing to challenge the very foundation of her people's rule. "I have called you here," Zyra began, her voice steady, "because I can no longer stand by and watch my people destroy themselves. For centuries we have ruled through fear, through power. We have conquered worlds, enslaved races, and built an empire that is founded on control. But we have lost our way. We have forgotten what it means to lead with compassion, with understanding. The nobles shifted uncomfortably, some exchanging nervous glances. Zyra's words were a direct challenge to the core of their beliefs. They had long been taught that strength was the only true path to leadership. And now, this young princess was daring to suggest that there was another way. I have spent time with humans, Zyra continued, her gaze sweeping over the room, and I have learned from them. Humans fight not just for power, but for something deeper. They fight for love, for freedom, for the right to live without fear. I have seen it in their eyes, heard it in their voices. They do not conquer to rule. They fight to protect. Jackson felt his heart race as he watched Zyra speak. He had never expected this. He had never imagined that a moment like this would come. The princess wasn't just speaking of her own people anymore. She was speaking of the future, of a future where both humans and Zavari could live without the chains of domination. But the nobles weren't so easily convinced. One of them, a tall, imposing figure with dark violet skin and sharp features, stepped forward. You speak of compassion, princess, he said, his voice low and menacing. But what of our legacy? Our power? The Zavari have ruled for centuries. You would throw all that away for the sake of some misguided idea of equality? Zyra didn't flinch. Her eyes narrowed slightly, but her voice remained calm. I would throw away a system that has bred fear, a system that has caused suffering across the galaxy. I would throw away a system that has left my people blind to the true meaning of leadership. The noble's face twisted in anger, but he said nothing more. Zyra had struck a nerve, and Jackson could see the change in the room. Some of the nobles were now listening more intently, their expressions thoughtful. Others, however, looked uneasy, unsure of what to make of this challenge to the status quo. I have come to understand, Zyra continued, her voice gaining strength, that true power is not about domination. It is about trust. It is about leading with empathy, with honor. It is about creating a future where all people, human or Zavari, can stand together, not as conquerors and slaves, but as equals. A murmur spread through the room. Jackson could feel the shift in the atmosphere. Some of the nobles were beginning to see what Zyra had been working toward. It wasn't just about overthrowing her mother or the current regime. It was about building something new, something better. The tall noble who had challenged her stepped back, his face a mask of frustration. You are a fool, Zyra, he spat. You will ruin everything. My support for you ends tonight. Zyra didn't respond to him. Instead, she turned her gaze to the other nobles, some of whom were still uncertain, others who were now looking at her with newfound respect. You have a choice, she said softly, yet with authority. You can choose to continue down this path of fear, or you can choose to stand with me. Together, we can rebuild this empire, not through conquest, but through unity. The silence in the room was deafening. Jackson could see the internal struggle written on the faces of the nobles. Some were still loyal to the queen, while others were beginning to see the possibility of something different. But there was one thing that was undeniable. Zyra had given them a choice, and that choice would change everything. Jackson felt a hand on his shoulder, and he turned to find one of the guards standing beside him. The guard, a tall Zavari with dark blue skin, looked at him with a solemn expression. The queen has summoned you, the guard said. Now. Jackson's heart sank. He knew what this meant. The queen had not been present for the meeting. She had likely been listening from a hidden chamber, watching her daughter's every word. And now, it was time for her to act. He followed the guard down the winding corridors of the palace, his mind racing. What would happen now? Would Zyra's plan succeed, or would the queen squash it like she had every other challenge to her authority? They reached the queen's private chamber, and the guard motioned for Jackson to enter. Inside, the queen sat on a throne-like chair, her regal posture as imposing as ever. Her eyes glowed with an inner fire, a fire that Jackson could almost feel burning through him. "So," Queen Aralissa said, her voice low and dangerous, "you've managed to turn my daughter against me. How proud you must be." Jackson didn't answer at first. He had nothing to say that would change her mind. The queen's grip on power was absolute, and if she wanted to destroy Zyra's vision of the future, she would do so without hesitation. "You don't understand her," Jackson said finally, his voice steady. "Zyra isn't trying to destroy everything. She wants to build something better, something where everyone has a chance. She's not like you." The queen's eyes narrowed, her gaze cold. "You are nothing but a tool, a prisoner who has poisoned my daughter's mind with your foolish human ideals. She has no place for compassion in a galaxy ruled by power." Jackson stood his ground, despite the fear creeping into his chest. "You're wrong. It's not about compassion, it's about strength. And Zyra understands that true strength doesn't come from domination. It comes from the courage to change." For a moment, the queen didn't respond. She simply stared at him, her lips pressed tightly together. And then, in a voice colder than anything Jackson had ever heard, she spoke. "You think you understand strength, human? You think your kind can teach me anything? You are mistaken. And I will not let my daughter's weakness destroy everything I have built." Jackson felt a chill run down his spine. He knew what was coming. The queen's wrath would be swift and unforgiving. But Zyra's words echoed in his mind. "We can make a different future." He was not afraid of the queen. He was afraid of what would happen if Zyra failed. Outside the chamber, the sound of footsteps echoed through the palace halls. A small group of soldiers had gathered, led by the noble who had challenged Zyra earlier. They had made their decision. They were not going to let her succeed. The palace was about to erupt in chaos. The question was, who would emerge victorious? As Jackson stood in the queen's chamber, waiting for whatever came next, he realized one thing. This was more than just a battle for power. This was a battle for the future. And no matter what happened, it would shape the destiny of both humans and Zavari alike.